thank you so much, Doreen, for joining us. And thank you, everyone, for being part of our seminar today. I'm Vint Cerf. I'm Vice President and Chief Internet Evangelist at Google, but for purposes of today, I'm also a member of the Interplanetary Network Special Interest Group Board of Directors and a friend of Doreen Bogdan-Martin, who is our guest today. Doreen, I hope you'll forgive me for being terse about your background because we want to hear from you more than we want to tell everybody about you. But the important things for me are that you have been a part of the ITU environment for quite a long time. You ran ITU-D for a significant number of years and are the first woman to be elected the Secretary-General of the ITU. We are so delighted by that outcome and so excited about your vision for the future of ITU and its work. And of course, today, we're extremely interested to ask you about our work at the IPNSIG on the interplanetary internet backbone and the role that ITU might likely play in that, because much of the standards work, especially radio-based work, falls into ITU-R's focus. So unless you had some opening remarks to make before I start asking you questions, I will begin with questions, but let me pause and ask if you have words of greeting to our audience today.
Well, thank you, Vint, and it's wonderful to be here and always nice to have a moment to converse with you on an important topic. In preparing for today's talk, I was just thinking back to when you were here in 1998 and you actually started speaking back then at an Internet Society gathering here in Geneva about the interplanetary internet. So it's great to reconnect on that important topic and look forward to finding hopefully ways that the ITU can contribute to this important discussion. Thank you.
Well, I do remember very well being so excited to tell my colleagues that this idea of an interplanetary backbone network was no longer just science fiction. And that was 25 years ago. And I think it's fair to say that when my colleagues and I at JPL started talking about this way back in 1998, we were trying to imagine what should we be doing then to be ready for what might be needed 25 years later. And so here we are. And I think those of us who are have been involved in this, and many of the people who are listening in today, will know that we are at the cusp now of a return to space in a very dramatic way. That it's not just returning to exploration of our solar system, but commercialization is part of that package. So let me start with a relevant first question. Why focus on space now, from your point of view? What are some of the most exciting avenues for the space economy that we need to start thinking about right now?
Yeah, well, thank you. And as you said, I think we're at this incredible moment where we are on the cusp of some amazing things in space. And maybe just to start, like going back and then we'll look forward. I think what people often don't recognize is that the ITU has had this long relationship with space issues. We do have what I would say is this long and rich history working on space issues actually since 1959, which was
Wow.
two years after the launch of Sputnik, of course. And around the time with the US founding ARPA, and of course, many of those early innovations that you helped yourself drive forward. Also, just to mention in terms of history, ITU was actually the first institution to negotiate space regulations, and that was back in 1963. So this year, an important year, right? It marks actually 60 years since we actually started allocating radio frequency spectrum for space communications. And of course, since then, we've developed global regulations and standards, as you mentioned, that help underpin, I think, the entire space ecosystem. And so maybe jumping to your question of today and why now, I think it's unbelievable what we're seeing with space economy growth. If we look at figures from last year, so we had some 424 billion in terms of what was estimated in terms of the space economy. And we're looking at a market that could equal 1 trillion by 2040. So I think those numbers alone are quite incredible. And I think at the same time, we're seeing more players. And when it comes to governments, we're seeing many more, spacefaring nations that are stepping up. Last year, we did have some 11 countries that have now the ability to actually send objects into space using their own launch vehicles. Of course, we have lots of private sector interest and lots of private space actors that are jumping into the field of space communications and also Earth observation. I think there's major innovations that we're starting to see, and many of those innovations are making it kind of easier and also cheaper for more players to get into space. And some of the areas that we're seeing space activities advance quickly are things like in-orbit servicing of existing satellites for refueling. We're seeing repair efforts, of course, space tourism on the rise, space-based data storage, manufacturing, resource extraction, and mining of asteroids, just by way of example. I think what's interesting is that it's no longer in the exclusive domain of national space agencies. Of course, space governance continues to be kind of focused on a nation state, but we're seeing lots of new actors, as I mentioned. I would say another kind of big trend is that we're also seeing a sort of shift from traditional satellite markets, where we had kind of the focus on the communications piece, the Earth observation piece, and then the navigation GPS piece. And now we're looking at something that's much more integrated, with massive growth in potential revenues, as I mentioned before, linked to space-based activities. I think that outer space is going to is becoming a place to experiment, to extract resources, to manufacture, to communicate, and as some say, maybe eventually to live on. And a lot of this big flurry of activity, I think, is raising lots of excitement. I would say also, Vint, at the same time, I think it also presents new challenges. Also, it'd be great to hear from you what you think about some of the challenges with such a proliferation of new space actors. How do we avoid problems linked to space debris? How do we do space traffic management? I think as we look today, our estimates show that there's about 8,200 individual satellites currently in orbit, with 180, I think, successful orbits in last year alone. But what's quite incredible is when we look at the satellite network filings, so the number of announced satellites to be launched that based on our registry system, we actually see 1.7 million, which is just mind-boggling, 1.7 million non-geo satellites that should be launched and come into orbit by 2030. And I guess that piece comes back to the challenge issue, which is, space traffic management, orbital debris, and how we need to find ways to better manage that.
That's actually terrifying when, even though space is big and even the near Earth space is big, 1.7 million objects flying around in orbit, it makes it sound like getting out of the Earth's atmosphere and into orbit around the moon, for example, would run the risk of running into one or more satellites on the way, to say nothing of satellites running into each other because of potential variation in orbital dynamics. So that's actually kind of a scary picture, and it's something that we clearly will need to rise to the challenge. You've already answered a number of questions that I would have asked, so I'm going to move on to ITU itself. You have this long history, 150 plus years of operation, starting with telegraphy, and a century later or more now, a wide range of international interests, including capacity development, which you did so well at ITUD, and radio allocations at ITUR, and telecommunication standards in ITUT. The most immediately relevant area of ITU responsibility will be radio frequency allocation, which you've alluded to already as a practice that ITUR is responsible for. So do you feel that ITUR is equipped to address this new need as we start using frequencies on Mars and the Moon or elsewhere? Is ITUR the right place to turn for frequency allocation and assignment and deconfliction?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I would say, I think based on our long history, I do think that we are well placed, and as you rightly noted, we have a perspective and a mandate that focuses on developmental issues, capacity development, the standards pieces, and of course the radio communications pieces. And I would say, I think from an institutional perspective, we kind of have sort of what we need. We have things in place. We have a process, I think that you know well, linked to the regulation of radio spectrum in outer space. We have our upcoming World Radio Communications Conference that will come up in November this year, and that conference, of course, looks at current and future spectrum needs. I think it will be interesting. We do have an agenda item, I think it's agenda item 10, where we look at future issues, and is something that will come up in the context of future issues. And what it means is that once the conference agrees, and if there are no objections, and we don't see that there would be any, that this would then be studied for the next 4-year period, and then the conference would come back in 2027. We also have this new group in the radio communications sector within the context of Study Group 7. It includes space research, and it extends as far as the moon. And so earlier, actually this year, Study Group 7 approved a new question on radio astronomy in the shielded zone of the moon, SZM. And of course, as you know better than I, the shielded zone is the part of the moon that we can't see from Earth. So it's perfectly quiet, unpolluted by human-made noise, that radio astronomers have been trying to protect it from interference for many years, I think back to the early 1970s. And so this study group is now studying which specific bands radio astronomers can use on the moon and how to transfer the data collected from the moon to the Earth. So I think it's quite exciting for those issues now to be addressed. And as I said, it will come up in the context of an agenda item at this conference to then be studied for the next 4 years.
Oh, I'm really glad to hear that, because getting a start on the various radio allocation challenges that we can anticipate is a good thing. Mechanically speaking, sometimes footnotes get used as a way of adjusting various and sundry allocations. Are we going to be using that particular method, or do you think that the Study Group 7 work will be more substantive? And here I'm showing my ignorance. I don't know whether a footnote is more or less important than some other way of expressing the allocations, but it's clear that if we want protected zones, as you were describing, but at the same time we need to get the information out from the space telescopes, and most likely that has to be done by radio. We'll have to find the right spectrum in order to do the communications part without interfering with the observation part.
Yeah, no, I mean, I will openly declare my ignorance as well. I don't know if it'll be a footnote or not, but I think the encouraging thing is, as my technical colleagues say, if there is absence of opposition, that such an item would then be studied and, as I said, come back to WRC 27 for approval. So at this point, I'm not aware of any such objections that would come up, and how it's reflected ultimately, we'll see.
Well, perhaps after WRC 23 in November, perhaps in the new year, we can come back and ask you for what the outcomes have been and what the study group is planning to tackle. So let's move on to another broad concept, space for all. You know, we talked about internet is for everybody, and in some sense, space should be for everybody as well. What special considerations do you think should be given to the developing countries so that they can participate in the commercialization of space and interplanetary communication? And before you answer, I will make one observation that you alluded to earlier, and that is that the commercial lift capability to get into orbit makes it possible for any country that wishes to do so and has the wherewithal to do so can purchase the ability to boost into orbit, whereas before they would have had to have their own internal, typically government-sponsored capability. So the commercialization of lift capacity really makes a dramatic change for everyone. But how do we make sure that all of those developing countries have an opportunity to participate in the commercialization of space?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. Of course, I answer you wearing my my SDG pin, because I think it's also linked to the Sustainable Development Goals, and I was let's say pleasantly surprised to learn that some 40% of SDG targets actually rely on Earth observation and global navigation systems.
That's okay.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting. And then it comes to for all. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think that space for all, it has to be more than this kind of declaration of intent. I think it is about implementing equitable access to the benefits of space for everyone, and of course for all of humanity. I mean, this is something that comes up time and time again. In the context, last year we had some discussions linked to the ITSO meeting. Of course, we had the ITU Plenipot, where we had much discussion about our role in the Space 2030 agenda, and this opportunity, let's say, as you put it, based on the incredible things happening in space, that we can actually have more equitable access to the benefits of space for all countries. You know, we may never have the opportunity to travel to space, but maybe others will. But I do think that by leveraging space, leveraging more equal opportunity in space, can potentially help us to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. I think it's really about trying to make those benefits real, trying to make those benefits meaningful for everybody, and that would include spacefaring nations. And I think that ITU has a pretty good track record trying to translate those principles of equitable access to space into concrete, impact-driven actions. We do help a broad range, I would say, of stakeholders, from governments to satellite network operators to space service providers, to actually establish their space plans for resources like spectrum and orbital slots. You mentioned as well before, working on the capacity building piece. I think that's also critical, working with radio communications experts, trying to share best practices through our radio communications seminars that we do each year, regionally and globally. And of course, mentioning the outcomes of our recent Plenipotentiary Conference, looking at this Space Agenda 2030, and also looking to sustainability in space are two factors that we're considering very, very strongly. I also think when it comes to participation in space, as you well know, Vint, I mean, the opportunities that we see today because of the commercialization, because of the fact that it's less expensive and that there are fewer, let's say, manufacturing and launch challenges that we saw previously, that the potential to leverage space-based technologies to actually close the digital divide and really connect the unconnected, which is one of ITU's core missions and mandates, is to provide universal, meaningful connectivity to all. And of course, to get there using space-based technologies, we need to address that equitable access issue.
So actually, you've touched on a tangential notion here that I think we should surface in this conversation. In addition to having access to space with launch capability, which helps you get your own equipment up there, having access to the content that's generated by so much of the observation would be very important for everyone. And so the idea of a kind of data commons that provides all countries with access to the information that the observation system can provide is a very powerful meme, which I hope we could pursue so that all countries could benefit from that which we observe. And that's very consistent with sharing the information that's needed to achieve the sustainability goals. Everyone needs to know what the facts are in order to know how they can respond to the challenges that we see lying ahead. So a data commons for space-based information might be another element in our agenda.
Absolutely. I think you're absolutely right. Yeah.
So one of the things that we do worry about is this pursuit of space-based benefits, which is an understandable thing. It's a little bit like the boom period where everybody was chasing possible internet opportunities. How do we deal with the risks that may arise with regard to sustainability? You alluded to this when you mentioned the 1.7 million possible satellites if all of the requests were honored. Do we see, apart from overpopulation, for example, are there other kinds of risks that you see that we should be aware of and prepare for?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think that as we address and discuss these issues, I think we have to be sort of careful. We have to have continuous dialogue. And I would say we also need to make sure that we're inclusive in these discussions. We need all the space stakeholders at the table, or the would-be spacefaring nations to also be at the table, because I think that dialogue is critical. It should be inclusive, and of course our goal is to be able to unlock meaningful and we want to unlock those benefits for humanity. And again, I refer to the ITU, and I think we have this sort of unique membership composition where we do have governments, but we also have the private sector, civil society, academia, and I think we can be helpful in that dialogue as we try to find a way to find a way forward that's fit for purpose and also agile enough. I think then if we were to make the analogy, I'm not saying it's necessarily the right analogy, but when we try to address something as important and as fast evolving as the space sector and space technologies, we're sort of, in some ways it's a little bit analogous to what we're seeing with the discussions linked to AI. So, how do we get the benefits and how do we manage the risk? And we've heard lots of different conversations linked to space as well. As you know, the UNSG has space issues on the common agenda discussions for next year. And, do you need a new entity? Do you need new regulations? Do you need a convention? And these are some of the discussions that we're currently grappling with when it comes to AI. But I think what's important right now, we need to just be inclusive. We need to think through the different issues so that we're not stifling innovation, but we're also trying to manage risks.
That's really very encouraging. And it strikes me that space for all concept implies a kind of multi-stakeholder perspective as we develop policies for exploration and let me use the word exploitation of space or commercialization of space. Multiple stakeholders are important because we need the private sector and civil society and academia in addition to governments to convene. And so there's an opportunity there in the same way that the Internet Governance Forum evolved out of the World Summit on the Information Society. Perhaps there is a kind of space governance forum that could evolve in a multi-stakeholder way that would allow all of those parties to surface issues and concerns as we try to establish policy that will produce benefits for everyone. So,
yeah, no, I think that's I completely agree with you, and I think that that's something that we've been trying to facilitate again in the context of the UNSG's plans for next year, but working closely with UNOSA and other stakeholders, ESA. And others trying to figure out, sort of who's doing what and where are the areas that we can together move forward, bringing the different actors and the different stakeholders together.
So, ITU's history, of course, has been revolved around multilateral agreements, but you did mention that the private sector and other entities, civil society and academia have roles to play. Is it your sense that the ITU's mechanics are able to adapt so that the multi-stakeholder models would be effective? Since historically, of course, it started out as an intergovernmental agency.
Yeah, so I mean, I think our 158-year-old history, okay, on the one hand, it makes us old, but on the other hand, it makes a lot of our work kind of tried and tested, right? We have evolved and our processes have evolved. And, I think the fact that we do have this sort of multi-stakeholder membership while also being a UN specialized agency makes us, I think, very relevant and very strong on this front. I do think that our different, let me call them layers, our legal instruments and our governance mechanisms also help to make our collaborative process inclusive. Of course, we have the ITU Constitution, which is a binding treaty that is ratified by our governments, the radio regulations that I mentioned before, that are linked obviously to the WRC, and they have this governance authority over different parts of the spectrum. And they're coordinating functions linked to outer space, including intersatellite communications. And then the sort of third piece or layer is the work that we do on standards. So we have IT standards. We also have recommendations. We have reports, guidelines, best practices. And I think that also helps to provide a clear path forward. When it comes to, again, the membership piece, I think it's important to remember the academic piece in our work, because that's really important. Also the SMEs, some people don't realize that we have a pretty big population of SMEs, many of which have keen interest in space. And our standards work is largely industry-led. It's obviously voluntary standards, but we rely on the industry to come and to work through different technical challenges, often in close collaboration with IETF, with IEEE, with ISO, IEC, and other standards making bodies. And I think that collaboration when it comes to standards making is really important on terrestrial issues and of course on space related issues as well.
So let's imagine, for the sake of argument, that we kind of project out to the 2030s, 2040s, 2050s. we're very likely to see commercialization happening in other than the moon. The asteroid mining has been tried. I guess one or two companies have broken their picks on that, but I suspect as the time goes on, as the ease of getting out that far away from Earth becomes more affordable and effective. Do you think that that you might need to imagine that you specialize the ITUR for moon-based as a region? So the moon is one place where you have to allocate frequencies, and Mars is a different one. In addition to what we already do terrestrially.
Well, I mean, I probably not a new region. I think the way that we look at our three administrative regions, I think it probably doesn't make sense to consider the moon and celestial bodies as a new region. I think that it would probably, if we were to do that, it would be a misguided, I would say, assumption, because we would then try to replicate the way that we manage spectrum on Earth, on the moon, and obviously terrestrial systems of network architecture and governance just can't really be extended into space. I mean, there's a lot of, as you know better, engineering principles that wouldn't necessarily work, and things like the absence of an atmosphere mean propagation conditions would be very different. There's not enough water out there. So we wouldn't necessarily need maritime services. So I think the applicability to just treat it like another region probably wouldn't make sense. And at the moment, there's no national sovereignty as well when it comes to outer space. So I think we have to keep that also in mind. But it would require greater cooperation. And, I think, again, taking a sort of multiple multi-stakeholder approach would make sense.
So this is very interesting because the term region is a term of art within the ITU structure. And I was using it as unintentionally as just a generic notion of we have radio propagation in the area around the moon, and we need to care about who is radiating and what power levels and where, and how do we agree not to interfere with each other. So we will need to do something along those lines. But your point, I take your point to mean that we may have to rethink how we do that, because the terrestrial environment involves national bodies, and it's not quite clear that we can project that onto our space targets. In fact, we tried very hard with the 1967 space treaties and other treaties to not do that. It's not quite analogous to Antarctica, because Antarctica does have terrestrial claims which have been essentially foregone and not exercised. Space is a more complicated environment in some sense, because we don't have any claims at all, and there's some sensitivity to whether there should be any claims. Although I will make the argument that as soon as you start commercializing things, there will be interests that have to be accounted for. And so private sector interests will certainly surface in that space, but so will the other, governmental interests, and the multi-stakeholder model may turn out to be necessary. It could very well be that as you approach radio allocation and assignment and management for space-based assets, that you may need to invent another governance practice than the one that you currently implemented, because the context is so different.
Yeah, no, I think those are really good points, and I do think we have to take it step by step. And it's probably, this is the moment where you say this can be embedded in a footnote, as you mentioned before, in a WRC outcome. But we don't have the solution today, but because there is, as I said, no national sovereignty in outer space under current treaties. And, I think that the Outer Space Treaty of 1966 is still what we often draw from. But when it comes to upcoming WRC issues and these kinds of how to treat the moon, these are places where we can avail ourselves to footnotes.
This is fascinating. Well, I expect that that ITU and many others will want to engage in helping to fashion the ways in which policy is developed and how it's enforced. That does raise all kinds of interesting questions about institutional invention, because if policies need to be enforced, who will enforce them and how will they be enforced? What if there are disputes? Where will they be resolved? I can tell you that the Interplanetary Networking Special Interest Group has been wrestling with many of these questions, and we look forward to your help and your colleagues' help to try to fashion, I would say, practical ways in which to cope with these anticipated challenges. I think we've already, I will have concluded, I don't know about you, that multi-stakeholder methods will turn out to be important here because of the diverse interests that have been facilitated by the fact that more parties can get into space now than ever before, and many of them non-governmental organizations. Do you think that there are other things that we can learn from ITU's experience, especially on the radio side, in anticipation of this mix of government and private sector use of space and occupation of places in space? Are there things that that you can already tell we should be adopting, or methods that we should adopt, or are we thinking tabula rasa here?
Maybe what I could offer, I think based on our experience, and in this case, I'm going to say our really long experience when it comes to radio spectrum, I think in this instance, the way that it was successful or started was being focused as you are, but starting kind of small. And if I look back to 1906, then when we were called the International Telegraph Union, the focus was to regulate just 2 frequencies that were used exclusively for maritime distress signals. And then we kind of took it from there. And of course, today, the radio regulations deal with the entire radio spectrum between 0 and 3,000 gigahertz, with allocations of frequency spectrum from 8.3 kilohertz and 275 gigahertz. So, going from small to something so vast and big. And I think what we have seen, and again, when I think of analogies to other pressing issues like things in artificial intelligence and others, if we can at least have a sort of set of robust principles that can then be taken forward, can be reviewed, revised, expanded as problems arrive, and keeping in mind the need for agility as the space sector is going to continue to advance at leaps and bounds with the growing interest by many different stakeholders in many different countries to have a part of that. Coming back to your reference before to the IGF, and also I would say the WISs, where the IGF was actually born at the first 2 phases of the World Summit on the Information Society back in 2003 and 2005. Those kinds of platforms, I think, are a good reference point for this conversation about the interplanetary internet and how things could be potentially governed. And of course, we also have the UNSG's efforts on the Global Digital Compact, and again, to reference the Summit of the Future. And I think those pieces also help us think about, how can this look and how can the conversation be taken forward?
So I know that you have a hard stop, and I have some questions from participants who have been listening. So I'm going to share those with you now, and we'll see whether our conversation can make some more progress. Alberto Montilla asks, how do you see the evolution of regulation and enforcement of spectrum assignment in other planetary bodies, such as the Moon and Mars, what role would ITU play? And we touched on a little bit of that, but my guess is, not to put words in your mouth, but you pointed out that the propagation environment is quite different, depending on whether you're on the Moon, where it's vacuum, or on Mars, where it's 2% atmosphere, and who knows what to say about, Jupiter and the other planets or moons. But how will enforcement work, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question, and it's a tricky one. And Vint, I think I'm going to borrow something that I've heard you say when it comes to these kinds of issues, that we have to be patient and we have to be persistent, because when it comes to thorny issues like enforcement, that's a big one. And I would maybe just comment on current Earth-related issues linked to enforcement. And of course, the ITU has the Radio Regulations Board, which has a group of members that are elected and are independent, so to speak, that deal with interference problems and issues amongst nations. Could that model potentially be evolved to cover these kinds of enforcement issues on the Moon? I mean, maybe. I don't know. It's hard to predict, because there are so many different kinds of issues, and I think the governance and the sort of ownership when it comes to these space discussions is, let's say, yet to be defined.
So the notion of interested party is important here, because clearly the interested parties are the ones with a stake in the successful operation of not only the interplanetary network, but also all the other things that might be going on the Moon and Mars and elsewhere. But I think that we might make a mistake if we said that the only interested parties are the ones who are actually there, as opposed to others who aren't there yet, but have the potential for being there. How do we make sure their voices are heard? And I think we're back to very interesting multi-stakeholder sense of policymaking. But policymaking and enforcement are two different things. And as you say, we may simply need to see how things evolve before we can figure out how to achieve the desired result, which is that a cooperative environment where we don't end up with harmful interference. Jorge Amodio asks, how will the coming satellite constellations on the Moon be regulated, or will they be regulated? And does ITU or any other part of ITU have a role to play there?
Yeah, I mean, we are currently responsible for the geostationary orbital slot locations. We take in, as I said, those orbital, the satellite filings, and I mentioned that very big number. And we try to ensure that these paper filings actually come into orbit within a certain time frame. Otherwise, those filings expire. When it comes to constellations around the Moon, I mean, again, I think that's something that can be taken up by a potential future WRC. We'll have to see how that discussion evolves as well.
Well, I think it's probably fair to say that in the absence of any aliens showing up, that the interested parties in space exploration are the population of the Earth, the countries of the Earth, the private sector entities of the Earth. And so those are the same parties that we would expect to want to have a role to play or a voice in policy and enforcement.
Yeah, I mean, if I could I was just going to add something just to keep this thought going. But I think what's interesting to see, at least if we look at ITU member states, for example, as a telecommunications union, our line ministry has always been traditionally the Ministry of Telecommunications. And as you well know, those ministries have evolved and become different things to keep pace with the fast evolving digital ecosystem that we live in that includes space. And I think what's interesting to note is more and more countries trying to advance national space policies. More and more countries we're seeing start to create space agencies. We see, for example, in Saudi Arabia, an interesting example where the telecom regulator, ICT regulator, took the responsibility for space. So it's the space agency plus the ICT ministry. Many have also followed the FCC's decision to create the Space Bureau. Again, an example of an ICT regulator that now has a whole bureau that's looking at space-related issues. So I think it's quite interesting to see how these conversations are evolving. And in that context, as India is hosting the G20, they have a specific track on space where the G20 members and their respective space agencies will be convening. I think in the next couple of days, we have our radio communications director that will be joining that. But again, to see how these issues are kind of advancing in national, regional, and global discussions.
I think it's going to be super important that the private sector has a role to play, because it is enabling the spacefaring ambitions of all countries of the world. Jorge Amondio asks whether the ITU will be more inclusive to participation from the private sector. And I think it's unavoidable that the private sector have a role to play in policy making, just as the country's national governments do.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point, and of course, as I mentioned before, we do have private sector membership with civil society, academia, and the private sector can participate in everything except when it comes to political issues linked to voting and other things. And happy to take that offline with Jorge to share ways that the private sector, if they're not feeling it has a space to contribute, to make sure that those voices are also heard.
So Mohammed asked a question which I think is aimed at me rather than you. He said, what distance does one switch from the current internet protocols to DTN? And the answer is, once you get out past the moon, and frankly, even when you're on the moon, DTN is your friend and IP is less so. We anticipate the use of IP locally on the planets and on the moons, data centers and things of that sort. But for interplanetary communication, you really need DTN. Dan York, currently orbital slots for geosatellites are managed by ITU, but LEO constellations are not. Do you see a role for ITU or another UN entity in helping manage that area a bit more?
Yeah, yes, I do, absolutely. I think we have the long history and the expertise, and we manage, as you mentioned, the whole geo filing or slot distribution. And I think that there is scope for the ITU to help in that space. And I think that kind of support and expertise will be needed. It's a discussion that our members are currently having. It may come up in the weeks ahead at the ITU Council, and I would certainly imagine we will see proposals at the upcoming radio communications meetings of the ITU.
Dan York says, what do you see as the role for civil society in space governance? And before you answer, I'm going to imagine for just a moment that if we think about just the interplanetary backbone network and not everything else, that it makes things more complicated. I can imagine the IGF beginning to look at this part, just the communications network part. And then as that begins to evolve, you might imagine expanding the discussion into a different form. But in any case, Dan is asking, does civil society have a role to play? And yeah. We assume the answer is yes, but how would you?
Yes, and actually I'll pick up on your point, Vint. In 2025, we have the WSIS plus 20 review. And, you know, we did have back in 2003, 2005, we had a number of references to kind of satellite communication related issues. But I would guess with how the industry and the space economy has evolved and the numerous benefits to be it agriculture or other Earth observation, obviously other issues, that this will come up in the context of WSIS plus 20 as an area when we talk about space for all and information society for all. And in that context and in other contexts, definitely the voice of civil society is imperative.
So Mohammed asked the more complicated question, and I know we have just a few minutes left, and I have some slides to show before we finish. So I think Mohammed is asking about whether that he says that in most countries, space-related technologies are protected by the state and non-citizens are not able to work there. Where do private entities fit in? I think we've been talking a lot about how the private sector fits into this, and so I'm going to ask Mohammed's permission to skip that question. There are two more that I want to quickly get to before we have some final slides. Juan Frere says, I understand the ITU regulatory model is based on regions or countries in the Earth context. How do you foresee regions will be defined in the interplanetary domain? And I think we touched a little bit on that. You pointed out that the region concept on Earth is implicitly involved in the local conditions on Earth, the terrestrial conditions, and that those conditions don't apply elsewhere. Some new concept that isn't the same as the Earth region might be needed. Is that a correct interpretation of what you said earlier?
Yeah, and I think, you know, and you mentioned this, it's sort of unique or yeah, I mean, the fact that we have these three regions, and then of course for our other work in standards and development, we define them by kind of, you know, real regions as we would normally know them. But when it comes to space issues and spectrum issues, we have Africa, Europe under Region 1, and the Americas under the Region 2, and then Australia, Australasia under Region 3. And, you know, would there ever be a Region 4? I think you interpreted my intervention previously well. I mean, let's see, but it's a bit different, as I said.
So we will have to define something, because we know we will have to manage our use of that space. The last question comes from Scott Pace, whom, as you know, was the former executive director of the National Space Council here in the United States. He said, what is the relation of the ITU to COPUOS, C-O-P-U-O-S, especially for mega constellations? I hope that's interpretable for you. COPUOS is another one of the organizations concerned with the uses of space, as I hope you know. So is that a question that you can respond to in a moment or two?
Yeah, I mean, and hi, Scott, always wonderful to connect with you. And thank you for the question. I mean, just to maybe confirm and underscore, and I know you have been very active in UNOSA and COPUOS as well. And we have a very strong relationship with our counterpart. And I think it's important as we look to the future and we look to this whole space interest in the context of different UN discussions, that we work even more closely, because there's many issues that are currently not under, let's say, the mandate of one institution versus another. And I think that's where that close coordination amongst like-minded agencies is going to be important as we navigate this forward. And we could take offline, Scott. I'd love to hear your thoughts as well. Thank you.
For the record, COPUOS is the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. Thank you, Scott Pace, for reminding me what the acronym is. Well, I think we close this wonderful conversation, Doreen, I'm going to ask, thank you, first of all, for taking the time. I know you're very, very busy with important matters. We have a few slides to share here. One of them is to draw your attention to other events that IPNSIG sponsors. Please come to our website, and if you have questions, send email to our secretariat@ipnsig.org. But we invite all of you to continue to participate. Here you can see some of the planned and already undertaken events for the year. As you can see, quite a few things are intended, although their dates have not necessarily been set. But please come to the website and you'll see the evolving firming up of the timing for each of these various discussions. Please come and join IPNSIG. There are a little over 900 of us now. We're relatively uniformly scattered around the world. And we invite all of you to participate if you're not already members. And I think that there may be only one more slide left, and that is to ask if you would be willing to respond to a short survey that those of you who signed up to join this call will be receiving. Well, your feedback is much appreciated. We'd like to make these sessions as useful as possible and as interesting as possible to you. So we thank you all for your attention. We look forward to further interactions as we pursue this fascinating adventure into outer space.